I'm excited today to have Edan Yago from Sovryn here, who is a core contributor to the project. And I'm excited about it because I think it's important for all of us to be exposed to all the opportunities for decentralized finance. We often focus on Ethereum and Ethereum Layer 2 projects. And I think it's really important for everyone to know about what's available. And Sovryn is based in the Bitcoin world. And I think it's a very interesting project. I also think they do a great job on UX and UI for users and getting them on board, which I found to be really helpful. So we're going to call you Yago because that's what you go by. So Yago, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how Sovryn came about, how you got into crypto, how Sovryn came about, and what Sovryn is?
Sure. So as some people who maybe have heard me speaking in other places might know, I got into crypto the most traditional way, which is to say I started smuggling gold when I was a young kid because my family were political activists fighting against the apartheid regime in South Africa. They were forced to flee the country and we had to get money to them. And so my mother got gold coins and sewed them into my clothes and sent me alone flying off to places to get gold to them. And
holy crap. Okay, so I want to tell everybody real quickly. I told Yago I really like to have stories to be told because people are more interested in stories. And this is amazing. Seriously? This is for real?
Yeah. I mean, so my family have a long history of activism and a long history of having to deal with governments that start out good and end up. Part of my family went through the Holocaust. They also converted their wealth into gemstones, which they had to hide up themselves. And that's how part of them survived the war. Among them, there were leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And so everything from anti-communists to anti-apartheid to anti-Nazis I have in my background. And
that's so amazing, man. That is just awesome.
And then the lesson, in all of these circumstances has been that the first things that these governments go for and the first things that crumble when freedom is lost is freedom over financial prosperity and freedom over financial sovereignty. And so I studied neuroscience with a focus on neural networks and got involved in I started a few startups in the diagnostic space. One of them was for bowel cancer, which killed my grandfather.
Wow.
And I managed to sell one of those, and another one actually is still going. But with one of them, I was really at the beginning of it in 2011, and I was reading papers in networking science, and I came across this paper which had nothing to do with what I was doing, but it made me spill my coffee all over my laptop and email everyone I knew and tell them that this is going to be the biggest thing of our generation. And that was the Satoshi white paper.
Wow.
And so for the now it's 10 years, I've been pretty soon after I left my startup, and since then I've been all in crypto all the time.
That's amazing. So when you read the white paper, did it immediately hit you that kind of history that you had of helping smuggling gold? I mean, realization that, hey, this is the thing that would allow us to have sovereignty and being able to control the finances and take that power and control away from people that take over in countries like your family has dealt with?
Absolutely. So it became immediately apparent to me that there was now a way for people to never have to hide gold or gems on their person ever again. They wouldn't need to try and figure out where in their house they could keep gold coins, and there would be an alternative economic system where their property rights would be controlled and protected not by violence, which is monopolized by the state, but by cryptography, which is available to everyone. That blew my mind. And I think we're only at the very beginning, like the very, very beginning of understanding the full implications of it. And it was extremely important for me to be involved. I felt immediately very protective of the idea. I thought that governments would try to shut it down almost immediately. And I also remember emailing my friends, telling them that they had to get into Bitcoin because the market cap was going to be $1 billion one day.
That's awesome. Well, I hope they took your advice.
No, they didn't, and they rue the day.
I'm sure they do. Yeah, all of us are the crazy ones that everybody kind of says, yeah. And then they call us later and say, is it too late? Is it too
Yeah.
late? I'm really kind of moved by the power of kind of what your motivation was for that. Did you immediately kind of understand, obviously you had a technical background, but did you immediately kind of understand in a tangible way how brilliant and powerful the model was and how everything worked together, the mining and everything else? I mean, to you, was it like, okay, yeah, I immediately get this, or was this a longer understanding process for you?
I didn't, but I got so excited it didn't matter.
That's awesome.
Like I got excited. Like most people I've heard encountered it back, around that time. Most of the people encountered it dismissed it initially.
Yeah.
Even people who really got into it pretty quickly. But for me, I fell in love.
That's great. And I got to believe that a lot of that is your family background really made it so obviously clear to you. Most of us haven't been through that, right? I've never experienced anything totalitarian in my life. So for me, it was more of
you're not living in Australia.
For me, it was more just trying to understand it technically and why it was better. And I think that's why I was the typical one that kind of said, yeah, okay, and then came back later, but I can definitely see how that's a powerful impetus. All right, so did you immediately start trying to work in Bitcoin at the time?
Well, the first thing I did was actually get involved. So I've been involved in a number of ways. The first way I was involved was actually sort of on the lobbying side.
Oh, wow.
And trying to, I helped form an organization and was one of the founding members of an organization called DATA, the Digital Asset Transfer Authority, we called it.
Okay.
And it was an SRO, a self-regulatory organization set up by the Bitcoin community back in 2012, 2013. And the goal was to try and convince the regulators that we were going to regulate ourselves so that they would leave us alone long enough for us to get big enough that it wouldn't. Data is pretty much defunct right now, but out of that grew a company called Fiat, of which I was the CEO. And what we did is build software allowing banks to do cross-border settlement by using Bitcoin. And then what eventually ended up being our biggest customer base were remittance companies. And we were doing remittances across the world to Brazil, to Nigeria, to the Philippines, to China, to India.
Were you kind of bulk provider into their local, or were you actually sending to individual recipients?
No, we didn't work with individual recipients. We always connected payments companies on either side, and we would manage the settlement for them. And we could do settlement. We at some point started paying companies that were doing settlement with us instead of them having to pay us. We were making, like, there was water coming out of there was money coming out of the faucets for a while because there were massive ARB opportunities that, you could send funds to China and make 20%. You could send funds to Nigeria and make 25% on that transaction. So if somebody right, and this was back in 2016, 17. And so what we were basically using is all of this remittance flow as free money that they were giving us to do this ARB trade with. And so eventually, just to encourage them to do a bit more, we would say, well, we'll give you a little bit of a rebate on the flow that you send through us.
That's awesome. That makes sales a heck of a lot better, easier.
It was. And we were doing so much volume that JP Morgan started complaining to our corresponding banks, telling them that they were going to shut off. Most of our banks were European banks, and they started saying that they were going to shut them off from dollar settlement if they didn't shut us down. And so I came home one day from the first vacation I had taken in maybe half a decade. And there was a letter waiting for a read from 3 of our banks, all coincidentally saying that they had done a risk analysis independently and and were requesting that we see being a customer of theirs. Now, we were regulated, and we had letters of recommendation from regulators. The FCA had a letter of recommendation that they provided for us. We were working with them hand in hand. I met with regulators frequently. These were the worst years of my life. I hated talking to these people.
I'm sure.
But we were, suited up the wazoo, and we still got shut down. And it was at that point that I was like, fuck this shit. I'm not doing anything regulated anymore. We're going to create a truly outlet economic financial system.
Wow. Okay. So that's painful. I actually went today to set up it's crazy. I went to set up a bank account at Bank of America today for a company that my partners and I own that's trading tools. and one of the owning companies in that company has crypto in its name, and Bank of America refused to open an account today, which is just insanity to me. But anyway, okay, so that's a wake-up call. So the entire business, you essentially had to shut down if you had no banking, I'm assuming.
That's right. We sold the company, but it was effectively just selling the empty shell of the regulated entity and its relationships. Yeah,
that's just brutal. So that's a big stepping off point for you, and you kind of, now you're like, okay, I am going to build something that nobody can take down, right? On top of what Bitcoin has. Is this when Sovryn came about? Or what?
No, so I began working on a protocol to do cross-border settlement on Ethereum, using stablecoins and providing an insurance system. It was a phenomenal system, which we never launched because we didn't feel like we had enough funding to launch it in a way where we would be able to provide what we wanted to provide, which was, the highest level of financial guarantees and risk management. A few months later, Curve launched, doing part of what we were doing, and it was like the move fast and break things thing, and they've done very, very well. And so I think that was at least an indicator. So we, this was back in 2017, 18, and we had developed a system with Futarchy. We had developed a system which allowed you to swap stablecoins for other stablecoins at basically no slippage. We had built in a system for liquidity mining. Before liquidity mining was a thing, and the market had crashed, so we found it very, very difficult to raise the funding that we wanted. I actually still think it was the right idea, because when you're dealing with people's funds, I think that's a sacred responsibility, and I think there's been so many instances of these systems having bugs, getting hacked, funds getting locked up, even by by the best teams, right? So I mean, if you think about the Polkadot team, right, and their multi-sig, which locked up 120 million in ETH, which is probably today like close to $1 billion or maybe a little bit more. These were by the guys who built the node, right? So I felt personally responsible for that, and so I think it was the right decision. I think it was a principled decision.
So you made a principled decision that you didn't feel like you could secure investors' money well enough.
Yeah, not investors. I wasn't curious. I didn't bother about that.
I don't mean your investors. I mean
users. What I meant was people who would be depositing their funds into the system.
Right.
And to my mind, we had to have enough funding to have a team which would be able to operate 24/7, which would be monitoring the system, and to have enough coverage that we would be able to offer the first type of insurance. Back in that period of time, also, the tooling and the sort of best practices around how you audit and secure smart contracts wasn't as developed as it is now.
Sure.
So I think financially it was a poor decision, but it was a principled decision. I endeavor to choose the principled decision rather than the financial decision. And I think I've done well enough with that I feel comfortable with it. So, but I did work on that project for about 2 years.
Wow.
And then
that's a painful decision too.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, but this is the nature of entrepreneurship and risk taking. You're not always going to hit it out of the park, and so your North Star needs to be that this is an experiment, and that you believe that if you get it right, it's going to be valuable.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think with what we see every day in this space, having people operating that way would probably be preferable in a lot of cases. So I think that's fantastic. One of the things I love so much about decentralized finance and DeFi right now is that we're so transparent about what went wrong. But I wonder how cleaner the picture would be for others if we actually didn't jump in until we felt even more sure of things not going wrong, right? So
right. I mean, look, there's a balance also to be found. I think a lot of great innovation has happened due to a willingness to take risks and to move fast. I think a lot of people have paid a price, and sort of the least informed community members have frequently paid the price.
That's right.
And I think some even well-meaning founders have the sense of that, well, if there objective is going to be funded by suckers along the way, well, then that's just a more efficient use of the funds. Like it's a redistribution of funds from suckers to people
suckers to smart people.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that sucks. So yeah, and look, I think we have a lot of careless, irresponsible people. I think we have a lot of very responsible, concerned people who have launched things that ended up having vulnerabilities. And I think it's a really tough balance to strike. It's impressive that you really made that call, that you wanted people to feel like, and actually for the time you were looking at launching that, I think it's something that would have actually almost been required, that, the kind of 24/7 support you were talking about and everything, because people weren't yet even used conceptually to this, right? How do you get people on board, and how do you make them feel comfortable putting their money in? That said, we seem to have plenty in this culture or in the world, who are ready to ape in on anything that has, any kind of returns. So it's an interesting place to be. I was just talking to somebody the other day about, did you see that sushi vulnerability that on their miso platform? I think it was week before last.
I think it was
It fascinates me the way people come together who actually weren't necessarily friendly prior to try to solve these problems. That's something to me in our community that is exciting, that everyone realizes that the incentives are aligned. So we have to solve these problems before people get screwed over, but fascinating. Okay, so you're going through that, you decide not to launch it, you start seeing other things launching. That's a little frustrating, I'm sure. What did you do in the interim for that?
Well, actually, it wasn't that frustrating, to be honest. I mean, also at the time, these things were launching and they were getting traction, but they were nowhere near as big as they are now.
Right.
But what happened was I took a little bit of time off, and then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, there was global shortages of masks. And so I got together with a bunch of friends who I'd known in the Bitcoin space for a long time, and we started working on a decentralized network where people could donate money, and that money would get rerouted to wherever masks were needed. And then there was a network of people with 3D printers, and we designed a 3D printable mask. And so we could get masks to people in Argentina, in Israel, in the US, in Spain, in Nigeria. And so we wanted to create a sort of NFT for people who were donating, so that they would be able to get an NFT on their donation, and they would know your mask was donated to a hospital in Buenos Aires.
Oh, very cool.
And because we were taking the donations in Bitcoin, we wanted the NFT to be on the Bitcoin network. So we started looking for an appropriate technology stack for that. And we began working with a platform which is called Rootstock. Rootstock is a Bitcoin sidechain, it's Bitcoin native, but it is fully EVM compatible. It's got smart contracts, just like Ethereum does.
Right.
And so we built that project out, and that project was called Block 19. And then a few months later, some of the developers who were working on that showed me some stuff that they'd been building, which was a decentralized Bitcoin native exchange. And that ended up becoming Sovryn. And I ended up joining that team and contributing. And so for the last close to a year and a half now, I would think, a little bit less, I've been all Sovryn all the time.
That's great. So I love that it came out of something so good too. I mean, that's pretty cool that you guys were building something to actually provide protection to people, and coming out of that is a project that's also kind of helps people pursue financial freedom. Okay, so Sovryn is Bitcoin native, but Rootstock is EVM compatible. Is from a technology perspective, is this something that it was somehow a clone of Ethereum and then it was adapted to Bitcoin, or how does it work from a technical perspective?
Well, it's a chain which is very similar in many respects to Ethereum. Basically, it's built around the ability to run EVM compatible bytecode, which means that you can write Solidity smart contracts to it, means that MetaMask wallets and other web wallets will work with it. But at the same time, it's merge mined with Bitcoin proof of work.
Nice.
And it doesn't have sort of a different currency as its native token. Its native currency is Bitcoin.
That's awesome.
And so you get them onto Rootstock by using a peg, or a two-way peg, which allows you to move your Bitcoin from main chain to the side chain and back.
Okay. And does Sovryn provide that peg to move tokens into it? What Sovryn does?
No. So what Sovryn is Sovryn is a platform for building applications, and basically contains all of the core functionality that you would want for building out a self-sovereign financial system. So it's got trading, so it's got like an AMM.
Right.
It's got borrowing and lending. It's got margin trading. It's got Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. It's got a launch pad, and it's got more and more of these features. It's got like NFTs. It's got all of the core components, the core primitives that you would want. In addition to that, it's got we've developed a lot of tooling to make it really easier to use. So there's a fast BTC relay which uses the pig but isn't the pig, which allows you to get your Bitcoin onto the system within one Bitcoin transaction. There are bridges to Ethereum and BSC, and there'll be to basically everywhere.
Nice.
So the idea is that Sovryn is a platform for building out personal financial sovereignty. So we think of it as an operating system.
Okay.
And it is also the bridge between the Bitcoin world and the rest of crypto, and in particular, the smart contract chains and DeFi.
That's excellent. So today it has kind of all those fundamental personal finance tools that you talked about: swapping/trading, lending, margin trading. Do you all envision that as Sovryn, as a financial operating system, do you envision other people building on to Sovryn, or are most of the projects going to come from you guys on the core team building out those projects?
Yeah, so this is already happening. So
Okay.
So projects can work with Sovryn in one of two ways. They can work as sort of like a core Sovryn sub protocol, where basically they benefit from the governance. They're basically decentralized from day one, and it's a really powerful way for users for a developer who wants to gain an audience. They can basically plug into the OS, and they have access now to the entire set of users. The entire set of users have access to them, and the system has these bridges. It has the decentralized governance built in.
Nice.
Or there are other projects that are building sort of apps around that. So, for example, there's Babelfish, which recently launched, which creates it's actually an outgrowth of Cement. So part of the team that I had worked with on Cement eventually took some of their ideas, refined them, and launched Babelfish, which creates this aggregated and insured stablecoin system, mitigating risk. And there's a number of other projects that are doing the same thing. They're wallet projects. They're decentralized Bitcoin mining pools that are looking to launch on the Origins platform, which is our launch pad, and then integrate with the system. So you would have like Bitcoin mining futures on the system. And so the ecosystem is growing extremely rapidly. We introduced we still consider it an alpha, but we basically took off the wrappers in April, and it's grown faster than any other thing in the Bitcoin ecosystem right now.
That's fantastic. And those folks that are developing, some of those folks are applications that will appear in the interface on the Sovryn app, and then others will just be utilizing the functionality of the Sovryn OS, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And are you guys out actively recruiting or talking to apps that are already on other EVM platforms to come join you? Is the process of migration fairly straightforward, or is there quite a bit of work to be done? What's that like?
Yeah, so the process of migration is quite simple, and there are a number of projects like Chainlink and API 3, wallets like Quality, and things like the Graph that are all either integrated or integrating. And so it's becoming a very, very rich system and a rich ecosystem with a very, very unique focus. Sure. Because it's Bitcoin native. And this idea that you can combine sort of all of the benefits of smart contracts and EVM compatibility with the benefits of Bitcoin proof of work and the massive user base and the massive pool of liquidity and the security assurances, which are better than you'd find anywhere else, plus the ability to have zero knowledge proof scalability and the ability to integrate with Lightning Network, provides us with opportunities that are very, very exciting. So, for example, the work that we are able to do in places like El Salvador, right, where we're going to be able to provide Bitcoin-backed lending, which can be directed through banks and fintechs in the country. The ability to provide Bitcoin-backed stablecoins for a country that is using Bitcoin and the dollar as its two currencies. How do you merge them? You merge them with Bitcoin-backed stablecoins.
Nice.
It's a very, very new space, right? So there's nothing like this in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and there's also nothing like this in the DeFi ecosystem.
Right.
It's extremely new. It's like anything else which is new, a big bet. But I think the opportunity is massive because Ethereum is very, very big. Ethereum DeFi is very, very big. Solana, BSC, Polygon, all of these are sort of also showing how you can migrate users to other platforms. But there's this one pool of liquidity, which is Bitcoin, which nobody has touched. And if you think about what Sovryn is developing to be, in a way, because it's been difficult to work with Bitcoin and no one else has sort of had, I suppose, the guts to go and try and do it, it's building out the entire stack, right? So the Uniswap, the Aave, the MakerDAO, etc. of Bitcoin DeFi is currently being built in the form of Sovryn.
That's amazing. I had played with Sovryn, but I had no concept of really what you were doing underneath. I had no idea that how much you all had enabled by building this platform.
It's very complicated to keep up with everything that's happening. I struggle to do it myself, and actually, that is in a way one of the disadvantages that we have is it is quite complicated for a first user. You're kind of introduced to all of the stuff which is new, and it's paradigmatically new.
Sure.
And I think one of the cool things is we have attracted not just developers, but hardcore designers and front-end developers. And I think if you've been watching Sovryn a little bit, it started out, 4 months ago, it was unusable. And now it's really starting to look extremely user-friendly and polished, and it's just getting better all the time.
Yeah, and I think I tried it when you all first launched. I actually felt like from a user perspective, you were doing more to hold the hands of the user than the average project does. It's one of the things I rant about all the time in DeFi is the assumptions that projects make on the UX side. So I was pleased to see that. But then I just went in again the other day and was pretty blown away by how simple and clean you make it. And I think that a part of it probably that's driving that as well is that you've got a whole nother set of users here that haven't probably dabbled in DeFi at all. And so for them, everything's a new concept. That Web3 wallet and the functionality and everything else. So I think you guys are doing a great job of introducing it. And one of the things that I find frustrating on the DeFi side, if you look at alternative chains like Phantom and Solana and all of those, is I think you have an opportunity with Sovryn, with your initial interface, to actually guide users into the other products that are launching in the space on your OS, because I think that's what a lot of people have missed on other networks, is the opportunity to say, wait a minute, we're getting the first entry here. Let's make sure they know what's available, what's launching. So I think you have an opportunity to do that in the OS. But I think frankly, I think your UX and your onboarding is pretty good for a DeFi project relative to others.
Yeah. I mean,
really.
We have taken it as an opportunity to rethink some of the things from the ground up. And so, for example, if you think about the other chains, you've got 1 million different tokens that represent the dollar. On Sovryn, there's one.
Nice.
If you have bridges, you have 1 million different tokens representing, I don't know, ETH, because it comes across so many different bridges. On Sovryn, there's one, and that's because the system will re-aggregate these tokens as they come off the bridges to make the liquidity deep and the system simple for users. And it does this in such a way that it's still not taking away from users' sovereignty, so they can go and get, if they want to come over the bridge with a specific token, they can. But by default, and this is the power of defaults, right? The default sort of reference implementation UI and sort of the stuff that we write sort of helps users understand that they have this opportunity to have this much simpler interface. And it becomes a much, much easier way to learn. And so one of the things that we take extremely seriously is learning from the mistakes. And I think there's a whole bunch of systemic risk which has been introduced to other forms of the decentralized efforts across different chains. But let's take Ethereum as an example, right?
Right.
You've got two huge stable coins, USDC and Tether. And they represent these massive pools of collateral across the entire space. And let's say the system were to fork. USDC and Tether can basically decide which fork is the legitimate fork, just the two of them.
Yep.
Probably USDC alone could do it, because MakerDAO, for example, 50% of their collateral is USDC. Now, that's systemic risk in a centralized way that is, to my mind, it goes deeply against the grain of what we're attempting to build with decentralized systems. And so with Sovryn, we've had the opportunity to basically start from day zero and say, all right, how do we design the system so that it won't introduce, not now and not in the future, these types of systemic risks? Similar things with proof of stake, potentially introducing these types of systemic risks, or the fact that people can go and rehypothecate these tokens. So you go and you have a governance token that you're voting on with Uniswap, but you can just like now go and borrow a whole bunch of Uni tokens off of Aave and go and vote and then give them all back. And there's sort of like these governance
Manipulating it.
Exactly. Yeah. So a lot of thought has been given by the Sovryn community around mitigating these things. And I think, yeah,
Go
it's
ahead,
just
sorry.
I think it's just a remarkable communal effort to make sure that we have the highest degree of commitment to true decentralization.
So I'd really like to dive in this a little bit further on the stablecoin side, if you don't mind, because I just had this conversation about USDC and the centralization with Robert Lauko, who's with a project called Liquidity, which is a lending platform, and they have their own algorithmic stablecoin tied to that. And then Sam Kazmian of Frax, about his efforts in the algorithmic stablecoin side of things. Pretty fascinating. He's taking on consumer price index and some other crazy stuff, but I like when people are crazy enough to try that. And we actually discussed the fact that Hasu, do you know of Hasu? So Hasu actually posted on Twitter saying specifically about LUSD that he didn't think that LUSD could overcome the USDC control over Ethereum in the case of a fork, and because so much is dependent on what they're doing is dependent on other deposits of USDC, what you were just talking about. How does your stablecoin function? Is it algorithmic? How can people understand how yours is different from a decentralization perspective?
Right. So there's basically two types of stablecoin on the system. There's Bitcoin-backed stablecoin, which doesn't suffer from that problem at all, and we're working hard to make that the primary stablecoin on the system.
Okay.
And then in addition to that, there's the aggregated XUSD stablecoin, which is aggregated across Tether and DAI and USDC and RDoc, which is sort of like a native stablecoin to our ecosystem, and a bunch of others, and also has an insurance pool. And so those two things, right? One, having the Bitcoin-backed stablecoin be the primary source of liquidity, and the other having the other stablecoins sort of re-aggregated, protects users in a number of ways. So like, let's say USDC need to start blacklisting accounts. Well, you're actually never using USDC on the system, you're using XUSD. So it provides these additional, it's trying to build in the protections by default so that users don't even have to think about whether or not they're being protected, they just are.
That's awesome. That's a thematic for you, at least in your career in crypto, all the way through. In terms of how a Bitcoin-backed stablecoin works, based on, I'm assuming, some oracle that's pulling current Bitcoin pricing, and then the backing of that stablecoin is based on the current Bitcoin price against USD, or am I completely misinterpreting how that would work?
Yeah, so we do use oracles. The primary oracles we use in our system are actually based off the trading that occurs in the system itself.
Okay.
So you could think of them as similar to Uniswap oracles.
Got it.
And that, again, means that you're less exposed to centralized risk. But we have, like I mentioned, Chainlink are integrating. We have API 3 integrated. There's the money on chain Oracle system, which is an independent team and has been built up on Rootstock. So even there, we look to have more than one Oracle system, and then we can aggregate information and look for outliers. And the system will automatically get rid of any outliers that seem to be manipulating the pricing. So it's a very, I think, there's nothing perfect, and there's always going to be high degrees of risk in any form of financialization or in any form of decentralization. So when you combine the two, you're going to get risk. But
sure,
I think there's been a very conscientious effort on the part of the community to try and iron out these things in the early days, because afterwards it's almost impossible.
Sure, I agree. Documentation for the stablecoin and all of that, is that available on the website? I'm just curious for myself.
Yeah, so
actually.
there's a pretty extensive wiki
Okay.
there's actually, so there's a whole team of people who
Cool.
volunteer to write, and they've written up a whole wiki. It's
Nice.
quite
Nice.
cool. Yeah.
I'm gonna check it out. That's great. Were you guys funded from other folks to get started, or was this something you kind of all bootstrapped together, or how did the origin occur to get it going?
It started out bootstrapped. Then there was we raised some funds from a number of funds. One of the primary reasons we did that was that there would be a number of different token holders in addition to the founders, who would not founders or early team members,
Sure.
so that there would be a higher degree of decentralization. Then there was a number of core contributors. There was about 40 or 50 community contributors who ended up receiving voting powers in the first version of the DAO. The first version of the DAO was created purely for the ability to create the second DAO. So the second DAO's, which is the current DAO, which we call its genesis would be from another decentralized system.
Nice.
So it was like
Nice.
decentralization, like, yo,
Square.
dog, we heard you like your decentralization, so we put decentralization on your decentralization.
Okay, so was one of my next questions. Was we've talked about governance briefly and decentralization. I'd love to get, so obviously you formed a DAO to form a DAO, which is brilliant. I love that. So another layer separated on the decentralization scale. What else did you all do to kind of form governance and decentralize the system? I mean, is this something where, because you're still developing it, you can't like completely just release this to the wild and not touch it anymore? Or is there architecturally decentralization as well as governance decentralization? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's complicated because there are many layers, but at core, the central governance of the system is called the Bitocracy. And the way
Okay.
Bitocracy works is there's a token called SOV, first three letters of Sovryn, and the SOV allows you, among other things, so it's basically designed to be a coordination token for the community. And one of the key things it allows you to do is to vote on changes to the protocol.
Okay.
Now, the way you vote is different and demanding. You have to stake the SOV token, and when you stake the SOV token, you lose liquidity entirely. It's not like you can create a derivative token that you can then lend against or whatever. It's just your
locked
money
up.
is now locked up.
Okay.
And to encourage you to lock up for longer, the longer you lock up for, two things happen. The more voting weight you get on a quadratic basis, and the more revenue
nice.
you earn from the system. So a bigger proportion of, those two things are proportional. And so we have a lot of users who have locked up for 3 years.
Nice.
Now, this changes the way that you think when you are participating in governance, because now you're not trying to make decisions on the basis of what's going to be good today or tomorrow or next quarter. You're trying to make decisions on what's going to be good for the value of my token, which I'm not going to get access to again for 3 years over a 3-year period. And so so that's the way voting happens, and there's a large number of stakers with a high degree of participation. So we're very excited about that.
It's not something that's common with most projects.
It isn't, but we've placed, I mean, if you go even just look at our Twitter thread, our Twitter feed, it's so much. It's always talking about staking and governance, and it's something that is very important. Now, in addition to that, there are sub protocols, and the sub protocol is we're part of a newer phase that we're moving into, which we're experimenting with, where you can have like sub houses, which will govern like the launchpad, or will govern the perpetual swaps, or will govern and people have a different token which they use to govern that, but it is basically a derivative of the SOV token.
Okay.
And allows them to collectively decide how they want to vote to, sort of in the higher house. And so now imagine if Ethereum, every single dApp, sort of its governance system sort of voted within for changes in Ethereum, rather than them being decided by some whatever, I don't know what how those decisions happen, right? That creates a very, very robust layer of decentralization. It makes it very, very hard to attack the system. And then any changes that are introduced are delayed, so they don't happen immediately. So if you disagree, you're not going to be forced to continue using the system. You can pull out of the system. So you can basically fork yourself off if you
Wow.
disagree with how the system is moving. So yeah, those are the ways that we've thought about how you protect the individual sovereignty within this sort of bigger network.
I love the expectation of responsibility and work on the part of people that want to participate in governance. I love the fact that you have 3-year locks for some people that choose that. It gets you out of, look, I think that DAOs are going to fundamentally change the way all organizations and companies are structured in the future, or most in the future will be. I think that's going to be one of the things that permeates strongest into the rest of the world. And one of the things I think is going to be incredibly attractive to people who are running companies or organizations is, imagine getting out of the quarterly thinking process, right? Being able to think strategically for 3 years as a group of people, instead of having to think quarterly and what have you done for me this week? And I think that's a really powerful model. And it's really impressive that not only have you implemented it, but people are actually participating, which is incredibly uncommon in a lot of projects. I did a long interview with the guys who forked Steam off into Hive, and the battle they went through with Justin and what that was like. And still to this day, even though a big part of why they had to have that battle was the lack of participation in governance, to this day, they still have to beg people to participate in governance. And to me, if you've been able to marshal people into this and actually willing to put in the work and the complexity of quadratic voting and everything else, that's impressive. That's really, I think that bodes really well for what you guys are building. That's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. Is Sovryn, and this isn't a gotcha question, but is Sovryn pure enough for the Bitcoin maxis?
I don't think purity really is the issue with the Bitcoin maxis. I think so. I'm very vocally opposed to Bitcoin maximalism, primarily because I'm pro Bitcoin, and I think Bitcoin maximalism makes Bitcoin dumber. It's a type of complacency, which I think primarily comes out of, I think Bitcoin maxis are very, very loud, but they don't represent the vast majority of the Bitcoin community or Bitcoin users.
I agree.
And the fact that we are presenting a new, exciting, courageous, and adventurous path forward for Bitcoin, which is what Bitcoin was always about, and what was attractive about Bitcoin to all of us early on.
Sure.
I think is resonating with a lot of people. I think we are part of a Bitcoin renaissance. Bitcoin went through a big trauma with the block size wars, and that was 2 years ago. Well, almost 4 years ago now.
Further along now.
Yeah. And I think we're shaking it off, and I don't think that that's going to last forever. So I mean, a lot more and more people are starting to get really, really fed up with Bitcoin maxi-ness, because it is irritating, it's juvenile, but most importantly, it robs Bitcoin of its most exciting, adventurous, innovative potential aspects. So yeah, I think what Sovryn is doing, as well as what other projects are doing in the space, is leading to Bitcoin becoming a totally new thing. And I refer to us not as Bitcoin maxis, but as Bitcoin mutants, right? We're willing to go out there, splice out the DNA of anything that's useful, suck it all into Bitcoin.
That's awesome.
And make Bitcoin stronger than ever. That's
great. And look, my Twitter handle has that descript profile has anti-maximalist in it, and I oppose maximalism of any kind. But I've spent 26 years in tech, because I know one of the reasons I hate it is I know that competition makes everything stronger, right? I know your competition against Ethereum's domination in DeFi and BSC's attempt to take them on, and Polygon is another layer. I think all of those things are awesome for all of us, because I think the more people doing it, the more people competing, the more innovative we get, the more decentralized we have the potential to become, and the less able for all of this represents and means for the world to be able to be stopped. So I'm always amazed at the fear, as you said, of people who are so fearful of other things being built, specifically something like your project that's actually building to grow Bitcoin's reach and capabilities and potential for financial freedom, that it actually, as you said, should have. It amazes me the level of fear of people that want to just kind of have this thing just not move forward very quickly. So I think you guys are doing it in a responsible way, and you're true to the vision of what Bitcoin could do. So I think that's fantastic. But I was curious. I'm sure you all have had the trolls come along, but I'm glad you're standing strong. And I do agree that a majority of folks in the Bitcoin world are not that. So, and I have the same opinions of ETH maximalists. So, it's same thing. What are you excited about next for Sovryn and the ecosystem and what's happening?
Well, there's so much, but what I think is going to be one of the big things that's going to be happening going forward with Sovryn is introducing these tools to mainstream economics so that more and more people have access to them, not for gambling or gaming or Ponzonomics, but to manage their financial lives better. And so I mentioned earlier work that we're doing on El Salvador. There's work that we're doing on mortgages. There's work that we're doing on lending and remittance. And I think many of these things are going to be rolling out over the coming few months. Part of them because of my background.
Sure.
That's something that I'm able to bring to and the goal here is to build a new kind of financial operating system for the world. And I am amazed by the speed at which it is happening. It is not a short project. We're at the beginning of the blockchain story. We're really, really, really at the very, very infancy of Sovryn. Yeah. But even in its infancy, this kid is running.
Nice. So you feel really good about the adoption levels and how things are happening, and how many, I think probably the most exciting thing for you is probably how many developers are wanting to do things on it and projects that want to integrate with it.
Yeah. And anyone who finds this interesting should take a look at it. I think even if, so one of the cool things about Bitcoin and what really sets Bitcoin apart is Bitcoin really is money in a way that nothing else in the space is. There's Bitcoin, and then there's all of these technology platforms. And so this idea that you can combine that sound money with this technology platform is very, very powerful. Institutions are adopting Bitcoin in a way that nothing else is. When companies look what they're going to put into their treasury, it's Bitcoin. When governments look, what are they going to adopt as legal tender? It's Bitcoin. And when people are thinking, what am I going to use for remittance and for my, as a long-term store of value for myself on a generational basis, it's Bitcoin. Yeah. And so being able to combine that with the size of the sort of Bitcoin economy, I think you take that and you combine that with tools which allow you to now use your Bitcoin without having to go through an intermediary. I think that is the next step in the Bitcoin mission. And then being able to combine that and bridge that to the rest of the crypto space, I think we can help heal a lot of unnecessary tribalism, because at core, what we're all, I think, trying to do, besides just getting rich, right? I think what we're trying to do is create new spaces and new territories of freedom, both in the digital space and in the real world. And that's what sovereignty is all about. That's what Sovryn is all about.
That's excellent. That's excellent. It dawned on me just now that as you were saying that your background in remittances and your experience with financial institutions and banks in that world actually probably gives Sovryn a leg up on making it more accessible for us to get our money in and out of crypto. And so I'm actually pretty fascinated by the potential for where you end up with that.
Yeah. So we actually have Fiat on-ramps. We're about to introduce Fiat off-ramps. So you'll be able to take funds that you are trading and get them into a bank account if you are so inclined. People have to pay the rent. And so you could take your Bitcoin. You'll never have to sell your Bitcoin ever again. One of the cool things that's going to be coming out is the ability to, basically a similar system to liquidity, which you were describing, the ability to get dollar-denominated loans on your Bitcoin at 0 interest rate. Oh, nice. And then pull them into your bank account in the form of fiat. The increase in the price of your Bitcoin over the years pays off your interest, which is pays off your interest now when you're borrowing but when you're not paying any interest, it pays off like the change to your principal. And so you basically, if you have Bitcoin, you can now live on that Bitcoin without ever having to sell that Bitcoin, and you basically spend down on net liquidity, and you can still be getting wealthier and wealthier as your Bitcoin appreciates. This is the future, and you know, we're going to be able to introduce pension programs that take advantage of this and make it easy and accessible for ordinary people. So
That's
yeah.
amazing. That's awesome. No, look, I'm a big fan on Ethereum of Alchemix and Liquidity, because I think they both allow people to hold on to what they have and leverage it. So I'm excited to hear that's coming. All right, so I usually ask a question at the end of every episode. Who for you in crypto, in Bitcoin, in the DeFi space, do you have an immense amount of respect for, and you think is really dramatically helping us to drive forward to financial freedom? Who are the person or people or project that you really get excited about besides the people you're working with on Sovryn?
Well, there's a number. You mentioned Hasu earlier on. I think Hasu does a very, very good job of both communicating and educating. I think despite a lot of the hate that he gets, I think Vitalik at least induces me to think a lot.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, it's crazy, but even after all of this time, there has been nothing even close to another Satoshi Nakamoto.
Yeah, it's true.
That story is just like, it's angelic, it's beyond human. It's you know, I mean, how do you go create something which is going to change the entire structure of humankind and turns you into a multi-billionaire, and you just walk off the face of the planet as if you never were?
It's incredible.
It's like sent by aliens and then beamed back up. It's amazing.
Yeah, we're going to solve this problem for you. We're going to give you the tools. You guys figure it out. But yeah, it's incredible. You're absolutely right. I think that's a great way to look at it. How should people reach out to you, get in touch with, and try Sovryn?
Well, Sovryn, you can go to sovryn.app, sovryn.app.
Great.
Sovryn's Twitter is sovrynbtc, so Sovryn BTC.
Cool.
And I'm EDANYAGO on Twitter.
Awesome. Yago, thank you so much. I'm very excited, actually. Pretty fired up for what you guys are doing. I didn't have a full understanding of everything that you're building, and I think there's just an incredible amount of potential here. And when I think about leveraging the Bitcoin world into these tools, I'm very excited for you guys. I think you're on a great path. That's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk on your show.
Sure, man. Thanks for your time.